This is Grisha from CodeLab, and this video covers the basics of class components and how to convert these things to what we would normally use, which is functional components. So it is important to note that none of our projects use this. All our projects that use React would use function-based components. Since class-based components are older, it is more than common for Stack Overflow answers to contain this type of code, but don't be tempted to use it. These videos should help you understand how to convert class-based to functional at a high level. So class-based components are generally used for logic and to send variables from parent to child components, which is where constructors are best utilized. So for example, if a parent component wanted a smaller div to be yellow and blue, it would just pass a color and that component would have a background color of that said color. It also has lifecycle methods, which are constantly running in the background to sense any new changes and update the logic or render the new JSX code if necessary. Functional components can now perform the same actions in fewer lines of code and is generally easier to read and understand than class-based. So here's the general how to recognize class components. This is like a basic syntax. So a huge identifier is if it extends React.component, because that's a class-based. It would have a constructor that initializes all the parent parameters, so super props, and all the local variables. And then it would have a render method to return any JSX code or do any logic inside of it. And inside the constructor would also be methods that are bounded to the component itself. So this would be a local method called paint, which would update the local variable color using this.setState. These are more features of class component. So as I mentioned before, this.setState is used to update local variables, but you cannot do it directly. You have to use this as a method. Props I mentioned before are just read-only parameters, and generally if you just want to use it as inside a JSX code, you can do it like this, but if you do want to end up changing it for whatever reason, you would have to go back to initializing this.state and then have color, props.color or something like that, and then change it using a this.setState. Yeah, it would have, again, as I mentioned, parent and child components, and these are all the lifecycle methods. These four are the most popular you would see in most Stack Overflow answers saying, oh, you must use this method. But I'll give you a quick overview before I say why these aren't the best to be used. So render would just be the only required method of class-based components, and it's used to return React elements. Most of the logic is also done within this render. Component did mount is invoked immediately after a component is inserted. It would probably be most useful when you need to load data from a remote endpoint from a backend, and it would just initialize the component. Component did update is invoked when the props or parameters change. It would usually include a this.setState to update any parameters. And component will unmount will do the exact opposite of component did mount and is invoked immediately before a component is destroyed. It would clean up any timers that probably started in the component, or it will stop listening to any backend requests and invalidate any further ones. And the last three are very rarely used, and if a Stack Overflow answer does happen to use any three, you can go to these documentation links, which would also be in the key takeaways on the Notion page. So I'm not going to go too much into functional components because all these videos before was talking about functional, but yeah, this is basically used to render UI only, whereas we'd use class components for data management and some additional operations like lifecycle methods. But now we would use separate inline functions and hooks to do the same tasks that class components once did. And some of the main features for functional components that replace class is, of course, hooks. It's the best replacement for state and lifecycle. So instead of using this.setState for every local variable possible, we can just create a use state for any local variable we have. So over here, you can see we're using it for a variable named count and a variable named display text, which has two different use states. And we can use useEffect instead of component did mount and component did update. It could also be used for component did unmount. But yeah, useEffect would basically do the same thing as component did mount. It would listen for any changes within any variable we want it to look at, and it would basically do whatever we want. So if we do an update for count, it would immediately register here and then change our display text. And these are more examples of converting class to functional. This is the basic component. So basically just return a JSX code for props. Do notice that this identifier is no longer used over here, and this omits the constructor that initializes props, whereas functions don't use any constructors. You can just directly use props, which saves you quite a few lines of code. Here we're initializing a local variable called count, and whenever we mount the component, we would initialize it to whatever props is, whereas we can just use a use state for it in functional, and whenever it changes, we can just initialize it here. So here's another example using useState and useEffect. Here we're having a constructor that initializes our parent parameters, initializing our local variable. We're binding our event handler, which is handle click event. And whenever the component is mounted, we would initialize it. Whenever the button is clicked, we would update it by 1. And we would have our JSX code that whenever we press this count, it would increase it. And do notice that all of these, first of all, lots of lines of code. And this keyword is repeated so many times, and it's so unnecessary. And the functional component does a beautiful job of condensing all of this into count and set count as a use state. So whenever we want to update count, we can just do set count instead of this.setState, count, etc. useEffect, just whenever there's a new parent that calls with a different count number, it can handle that easily. We have an inline function that does the same thing as handle click event. And instead of doing our long count, this.state.count plus 1, we can just do count plus 1 because we have access to this variable. And for our JSX code, we can call our function without any this, and we can just display our count very beautifully. So this is an example for conditional rendering. But first, we can look at our constructor. It initializes our parent props, our local variable, our event handlers. And we have two separate event handlers here where we can either log in or log out. Over here is what I was talking about for the logic in render. So this is plain JavaScript. You would have a Boolean that would be first initialized to whatever it was logged in or not first. And if it's logged in, then we would have a button that would be a logout button. Otherwise, if we're not logged in, then our button will be a login button. And then we can just display it using our JSX in the return. However, our functional components offer a better version of this, but instead of JavaScript for if and else, it doesn't allow if and else, but we have to do ternary statements, which is a Boolean. And then if the Boolean is true, then we would first have our first line of code. Otherwise, if it's not logged in, then we would have our second. And it's important, if we're using ternary statements, it would only execute the first line of code. So it's best to just enclose everything into a div. We can have like 50 lines of JSX code, but if it's contained in a div, if the Boolean's true, it would display all those 50 JSX lines. But backtracking, we did have our use state that initializes if it's first logged in or not, which basically condenses this entire constructor. We have our handle login, which basically sets login to true or logout to false. And our button, instead of this if-else logic, we have our ternary statement where we can have either a login button or a logout button. And yeah, that concludes our high-level version of converting class-based to functional components. I hope this helped. This does cover the main differences, and if there's any other differences that are not listed here, I highly recommend reading the documentation. It gives a very detailed version of class components, but of course, we're not going to use class components. We just need it to convert to functional components, which is our newer, better version of code. So yeah, I hope this helps. I'll see you next time.